Welcome to the Weaver Sews. I'm Daryl Lancaster. Last time, I showed you how to finish off the underarm of this vest with a square armhole. This vest, my 500 vest pattern, is fully lined. We constructed two separate vests, one from the hand-woven outer fabric and one from the lining, leaving the shoulders open. And we joined them under the arm. Once the shoulders were sewn, the two vests nested one inside the other, and we could then machine baste all the edges together at 1/2 inch or 1.2 centimeters from the cutting line, except for the lower edge, which we basted at 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter. A Hong Kong seam finish was applied to the lower edge, encasing both layers, and the hem was turned up 1.5 inches or 3.8 centimeters as described in the pattern directions. Just a reminder that all of the directions for all of my patterns from the Daryl Lancaster Pattern Collection are available for free from my website. They are downloadable PDF files and contain some valuable information, lots of detailed illustrations, and step-by-step directions for how to construct the garment. The link for all the pattern directions is available in the show notes below. In past videos, I've made a big deal out of not attaching the lining to the lower edge of the garment in case the outer fabric, typically hand-woven, grows, which hand-woven fabric usually does. So why would I encase the lining along with the outer fabric with a Hong Kong seam finish and turn up the hem? Because this is a shorter vest compared to the length of a typical jacket, allowing the lining to just float around in there might not be comfortable or efficient in a short garment. So I've actually started to stitch the hem in place with a slip stitch or a fell stitch, but I've attached the top of the hem allowance to the lining only, leaving the front free. So if the outer fabric were to grow or sag, there is plenty of room for it to do that. I've gone ahead and attached the neckband. I've demonstrated how to do that in a previous video, the one that focused on adding piping to the band seam, which is certainly an option here. That video link will be in the show notes below. I chose to use this woven pile alpaca left over from another project for the bands, which leaves us the armhole bands. The armhole bands are basically attached in the same way as the neckband. Pin what you know, matching the shoulder and front and back dots or match points. But the lower edges of the bands are handled differently, and there is the option for taking some of the wing out of the top of the armhole band as it lays across the shoulder. Let's take this step by step. First, figure out which band goes to which armhole. Remember that the double dot always shows the back armhole and the single dot always shows the front. And here is the shoulder dot. I'll just take a minute to mention that I had to make a compromise here by reducing the width of the seam allowance that attaches to the armhole. I barely had enough scrap to cut all the bands, so had to sacrifice on width. But usually, I trim the band seam allowance anyway after I sew the band onto the garment, so I could make that band seam allowance 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter instead of the full 5/8 inch or 1.5 centimeters. Know where you can cut corners safely, or in this case, cut down the seam allowance safely. So we will pin what we know is correct and make the rest fit. We'll match the shoulder marking and the front and back dots. The lower edges of the front and back armhole band should extend 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 centimeters below the dot in the corner where you clipped the underarm intersection before turning the lining to the inside. Stitching this is a bit of a challenge because typically you would stitch with the band facing up. But that means that you can't see exactly where to start and end the stitching, so it goes right into that corner intersection. I find that I mostly sew the band on with the band facing up, and the last inch or so at the beginning and end of the band I do with the jacket armhole seam allowance facing up. This is super important. Double check that you have started and stopped directly in the armhole intersection, stitching along the original reinforcing stitching as it went up into the armhole stitching line. Now the directions say to trim away the band seam allowance only to 3/8 of an inch or 1.2 centimeters. But I don't have to do that since my seam allowance was short to start with. Remember that the neck and armhole bands in my patterns typically take advantage of a decent selvage edge of the handwoven cloth. Lacking a selvage edge, a seam allowance can be added and then turned under. Or a Hong Kong seam finish can be applied. We covered that in a previous video. In the case of this fur, I've done none of the above. There was no selvage edge to make use of in the scraps that I had remaining. Adding a seam finish or just a seam allowance to turn under on this pile fabric would be too bulky. So I made an executive decision to just sew down the raw edge and the pile would cover it. Now we get to make some creative decisions. That long selvage edge of the armhole band will basically fold to the back and get hand stitched to the seam line of the armhole as we just discussed. But how much you fold back can depend on what kind of look you want. You can fold the regular amount so the armhole band width and the neck band width are the same. You can turn under more if you don't like the wide armhole bands. You could technically leave off the armhole band and just bind the edge. The only way to really know is to try the vest on. I have, and I've determined that I like the regular width. Before we attach the long selvage edge to the back of the armhole seam line, we need to look at the shoulder. I've pulled out a vest made from an upholstery print for a better illustration because it will be nearly impossible to show you what I've done with a pile fabric. In smaller sizes, the vest armhole band sticks out, basically in horizontal fashion from the shoulder. And most are okay with that. In the larger sizes though, where the bust and hips are much wider than the shoulder, the armhole band can tilt up in a way that creates the illusion of wings, sort of reminiscent of that wonderful animated cartoon series that I watched as a kid about the futuristic space family. Assuming you don't want that look, the armhole band can be darted before folding under to give it a slope that contours better with the shoulder line. To do that, you'll need to make a couple of chalk marks on the inside of the armhole band at the shoulder. The first mark determines the shoulder line. Lay the vest as flat as you can and visually continue the shoulder line with chalk all the way to the selvage edge of the band. Next, we need to know the outer fold of the band. This can be identified in a couple of ways, all of which are complicated because I'm using a pile fabric. Can't I ever pick anything easy? I'll fold the band back on itself, matching the selvage edge to the seam line so that I can draw a chalk line showing the fold line. We will create a dart in the shoulder line of the armhole band, starting from nothing at the shoulder, extending to the band fold line 1/4 inch or 6 millimeters on either side of the shoulder line. And then tapering back to nothing at the selvage edge of the armhole band. Sometimes it's hard to get the dart started if the armhole band is pretty bulky, like this pile fur. Do your best. It's also possible to start at the fold and stitch towards the armhole seam line, and then turn around and stitch from the fold towards the selvage edge. Give that shoulder dart a good pressing. I press it towards the back, and then fold the selvage edge of the band towards the inside of the garment, matching that edge to the armhole seam line. Hand sew the selvage edge of the armhole band to the armhole seam line with a slip stitch or fell stitch. One more step. The ends of the bands will tuck into the vest, but they need to be finished first with a small Hong Kong seam finish. I have a small piece of bias here, about 1 inch or 2.5 centimeters wider than the finished band. You'll want to have the back side of the band facing up. That's the part that you would see if you looked inside the vest. With right sides together, pin the small bias strip to the lower edge of the armhole band, wrapping the bias around the band to finish the side edges. Stitch across the lower edge of the armhole band with a 1/4 inch or 6 millimeter seam allowance. Pull the bias away from the lower edge of the armhole band and fold to the back. Stitch in the ditch through all layers. Trim any excess seam allowance from the bias on the underneath part of the band where it will tuck into the vest. Place that finished lower edge of the band behind the underarm seam of the vest and hand sew the underarm seam to the band to secure. And that's it. As for a closure, I'm playing around with something. I've used this technique before, basically a loop and one large statement button. I have some really cool buttons, and I've made a twist ply rope from the chenille and a dark brown cotton. I will say my experience with rayon chenille is that it will eventually worm its way out of this twist ply rope. But like I've said before, often I try things just to see exactly what will happen and when. So making a button loop is appealing to me. I just haven't worked out the details. My daughter and I are currently feuding. She prefers this button down here along the side that the loop will extend to. It is a good color match, I will give her that. I also like this one, and this one kind of goes along with the piping. But what I really like is this piece of polyform clay that I've had in my box for years. It used to have a pin back on the back, which broke off not too long ago. But I can epoxy a flat button on the back and make an interesting button out of it. I'll figure something out. I'm Daryl Lancaster for The Weaver Sews.